Hi, welcome to the latest episode of Alta Heron. My name is Rob Runacres, and I'm joined by Hans Jodlind, who will introduce tonight's episode.
Hello, tonight we will be talking about Armoured Combat and its modern practice. And to discuss this, we're joined by Jessica Finley. Hello, Jessica, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing quite well, thank you.
Cool.
Okay. That is a fantastic room you're in. You're going to have to tell us about that.
Thank you. So yeah, this is my cell, my training space down in my basement of my house, and I'm really excited about it. Got it all set up in our new home that we just moved to in the summer, and in fact, I'm having my first official beginners class here tonight. So as soon as we're done, I'll get everything ready for a house full of students. So.
Wow.
Right, well, now you've made everyone jealous and extremely angry about that space as we interview from our kitchen and front room, respectively.
Well,
I'll let Hans start the episode.
Yeah. Okay, let's start. What is meant by the term Armoured Combat? Is it like you can use any armor, or does it apply to a specific time period or a set of treatises? Can you just introduce us to the whole term Armoured Combat?
The primary thing that I study and that many of the practitioners of what we think of as historical armored combat study is that classic Fecula period from, say, 1380s or thereabouts till about 1500.
So to be clear, we're talking in historical terms to the emergence of very much plate armour and going on into that sort of Gothic armour and white armour, that sort of thing, the full suit as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, certainly, there probably were techniques that were intended for earlier armoured periods, the Vikings and etc. But, much like swordsmanship at that time, since we don't have treatises that tell us how it was done, to do that work would be entirely experimental and not based in any literature. And really, we're coming out of that fight book period where you have a literature to base your interpretation on, not just the armor and the swords that were being used.
Is there a bias to one specific weapon form, or is it all kind of encompassing when you use these kind of treatises?
The classic weapons that we think of that were discussed in the treatises is obviously the longsword, much like it was used out of armor, it gets used in armor, though in a slightly different manner. The spear, the dagger, which is, your sidearm, that thing that you're always carrying with you. The poleaxe, which I have a little trainer on the wall there behind, which kind of is all of those weapons in one, plus a little bit. And then finally, wrestling.
We just roll this back a little bit to talk about the treatises. Are we talking about a single treatise, a particular note, or are there several treatises? Perhaps you can just take us through those.
Yeah, of course. There in fact are many treatises. I think if you were a person who studied the German system, Lichtenauer's art, you would probably start with, if you're familiar with Lichtenauer's art, there is the verse, right? The Merc verse that gets glossed on by various authors. Well, a good section of that verse is dealing with armored combat. So that would be a place to start. Of course, we don't know who it is that glosses it, say in Ringek or in von Danzig or these names that you know. But that anonymous glosser gives us, his interpretation of Lichtenauer's armored art. It then continues throughout all of the masters that you've probably heard of in the German system, Talhofer, Cal, Faulkner.
Where would I actually start if I was to look at a basic source to go with?
I would suggest to someone that they start with von Danzig. There are many good translations out there of this treatise. You can buy it in book form. You can find it on Wichtenauer. And I really do think that starting with Lichtenauer's verse is the way to go, because it's going to give you the basics that you need. Here are 3 or 4 things you can do with a spear. Here's a handful of things you can do with a sword. Here's a handful of things to do with a dagger, and here's how you wrestle. And so that's, you know, that's really the main things you need, and then from there you can expand out.
Okay, Jess, can you go through the composition of the armour? I mean, what actually constitutes the physical form of the armour? And then perhaps go through how the weapon forms that you briefly described are applied in techniques against that armour.
You know, classically what we're thinking of, again, as you said, is that white armor is that, you know, most everything is going to be covered in plate, but there are always going to be these gaps. Most of the armors, even really well-covered armors, are going to have in the joints of the body openings that are covered just by mail. So in the inside of the elbow, the armpits, as I mentioned, the palms. Sometimes up under the neck, you can get to, you know, an area that's just mail, the groin, the back of the knee, etc. The thing that's interesting about armored combat, I think, is that which weapon you're using can somewhat dictate the techniques that you're going to be able to effectively use against a man in armor. So using, say, a dagger, right? It is clearly effective, particularly, say, you go in the eye slots, right? There's not much to stop the dagger at that point. But maybe against mail, it's going to be less effective, or you're really going to have to, you know, double your hands up and get your body behind it to get anything out of it. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, the poleaxe is like, you know, a can opener, right? Like you can injure people inside their plate, irregardless of the fact that it is plate armor with a poleaxe. So, you know, it frees you up as to, you know, kind of what techniques you can bring to the game.
How much of these techniques, therefore, are you deducing rather than you're deriving from a source, something explicit?
The large percentage is coming, you know, directly from the armored combat sections of our treatises that tell us what to do. But that being said, depending on the level of armor that your opponent is wearing, it might be that, say, a sword cut is never going to work against it because he's wearing too much armor, whereas your next opponent maybe isn't wearing some piece of armor that does allow you to get a sword cut in. So we're allowed, therefore, to kind of come back through the whole rest of the art, the longsword, the unarmored longsword section of the art, and pull those techniques and bring them back in where they are effective and make sense in the situation. I would say that armor distills the art, right? So the way, my view of it is that with an unarmored sword, the whole body is available to me to hit in whichever way I feel like hitting it, with, you know, cut, slice, thrust, whatever I want to do, bring in my pommel, do all this stuff. Cool. So I can do all that stuff against a man in armor and not do anything to him. That being said, again, you know, I keep referencing the German system because that's what I study. But for instance, we have this idea of Zucken, that say we have a sword bind from this side, you can pull out of the sword bind and go to the other side. And that gets specifically called out as something you want to do with a spear in armor. So, and he calls it Zucken, okay? So, to me, it's a distilling of the available targets. It's a distilling of the available techniques, and it all becomes this very narrow focus, which is actually the part that attracted me to it in the first place. There is this very visceral feel to armored combat, which is, it's hard to explain because, right, because swordsmanship out of armor, it's clearly hand-to-hand fighting, right? I mean, we're clearly very close and we can see each other's eyes. It's not a ranged weapon, it's not a gun, it's not a sniper in a tree. But once you put on armor, it actually becomes closer, if that makes any sense at all. Because, you know, like with my long sword, I can from way the heck out here spring in and go gag, and I hit you, and it was really fast, and I wasn't entirely sure I was going to hit you until I did, and it happened, yay, and I hit you. And so there's this distance, whereas with armored combat, it's, I have to hit you, cool, I hit you. Now I have to couch my sword and drive it physically into your body. Like, I have to make this choice to collapse your armor and drive the sword into your heart. And that, I don't know, something about it just makes it, like I said, it's a lot more visceral experience. And one thing that's cool is you are completely invincible, right?
Yeah.
It is brilliant to, like, somebody go, bad, like, didn't feel shit, ha ha. Like, I mean, that's so true, and you have that experience. But I actually love getting all the armor on and suddenly weighing like 200 pounds because instead of being like 130 and fighting a 200-pounder, I'm like now 200 pounds fighting a 250, 260. And for some reason, that makes a huge difference, right? So these guys don't just...
But what do you feel that it kind of evens up a little bit? Because... It
evens up, yeah.
So you can put on this armor and become a tank and basically go up against another tank.
Yeah, totally.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
I know it's a weird thing, but like something about the weight ratios changes.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
that's really fascinating to understand.
Yeah, and I mean the ratio, like I did the math, and the ratio difference isn't actually that much on paper. Like the math of it isn't very much, but the sensation of it is huge. And the other thing it does is like my, which this is just me as a fighter. I'm not going to say this is tied to gender, but me as a fighter, like I don't have much range because I'm short, and I'm not particularly quick on my feet, right? I'm not like one of those real, you know, fast twitch muscle kinds of fighters. And I don't have to be in armor, right? I don't have to be at all. Like, that doesn't do you any good to be a fast twitch fighter. So I can actually rely on kind of that endurance, because I was an endurance runner in high school and that sort of thing, like endurance swimmer. That's like where my athletic prowess really is, and that's what armored fighting is. It's an endurance sport. It's an anaerobic exercise as opposed to an aerobic exercise, if that makes sense.
Question on reach. If someone's throwing out a long technique, then I assume the whole question of balance changes with that. Do you find that longer cuts, for example, or indeed extending a thrust or something, doesn't tend to occur in armoured combat because of the balance?
Well, absolutely. You have to stay in a very, very upright position. You know, and this is going to tie back to the equestrian section of the medieval arts, right? But similarly, in just like if you were sitting on a horse, once you're in armor, you need to keep your body upright over your hips. So movements inwards, you know, say a lunge where you were to lean, that's a really crappy plan. You know,
even with a long sword where you're really cutting in an extended manner, excuse me for my crass longsword impression there, by the way, are those actually you know, not tended to be done in armoured combat because you are pushing yourself forward, even if you have a deep stance? Do we see less of this?
Yeah, you know, we do see less of it. Now, it's interesting because the German medieval sources don't really talk much about cutting with the longsword in armor, but Fiore, the medieval Italian master, does advocate cutting in armor. You know, why that difference? It's hard to know. Maybe the German masters assumed you ought to figure it out, right? And they just didn't bother to tell you. Or maybe they didn't do it. It's hard to know. I will say that a really, really extended cut with a breastplate can be very difficult to do because it restricts your arms coming together. Depending on your breastplate, depending on your armor, whatever. But you know, I think that's a general statement that could be made. You can't bring your arms together as much, but you can still, you know, deliver cuts if you want. But how effective are they going to be, right? If the guy's wearing plate, you're not cutting through it with a longsword.
No, but what about the concussive force? If you take something, say just here on the clavicle, or you know, on the shoulder, do you have anything that could actually set yourself up for closing? Yeah,
it absolutely will set up a closing for sure. So you know, that in fact happened in one bout. I was fighting with Garrison Morton, who's a young armored fighter down here in the South, and he I guess, I mean, kind of jokingly, but Scott Wilson is his instructor, and had said, if you ever just get completely messed up in your head and you can't figure out what to do in the fight, just hit him really effing hard and then come in, right? You know, you can't think of anything better. So I was fighting Garrison, and I guess I was giving him a hard enough time, and out of nowhere, wham, like this huge sword cut across my helmet, which, you know, I mean, thank God I was wearing a full helmet and not a fencing mask, because it would have been I would have had a waffle face. But it rocked my head back enough, like it didn't hurt me, but it rocked my head enough that he jumped in for a wrestling technique. Yeah. So you can absolutely use it to set up those entries. And, you know, depending on what part of the armor you're attacking, you see in Paulus Cal, he shows it, it gets showed in Faulkner as well, I believe, attacking the sabaton. So that's the armor on the top of the foot, yeah. With a stab with a sword just straight through the armor, right? Because that armor is so thin, you could maybe punch through it like mail. And so occasionally we see a thrust through plate, but
since the foot is maybe steady on the ground, when the thrust comes down, it has nowhere to go, so it will stay there. So it might actually puncture through, which won't happen if you do a thrust on someone standing, because he will move in some way. So yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
So again, to the uninitiated, armored combat has to be in close measure.
Yes. Very, very close measure. For instance, if you're using a sword, typically you're going to end up falling to half sword position. So that is one hand on the hilt, one hand somewhere on the blade, right? About at the middle typically, but you know, you change that depending on the measure you want to play. But you know, it's a measure that for an unarmored swordsman is going to feel like wrestling measure the entire time, for the most part. Poleaxe, you're going to give yourself a little bit more, because, as I said, a strike with a poleaxe to the head, despite whatever helmet you're wearing, is probably going to be effective. Even with a poleaxe, though, right, as I mentioned, it's kind of, you can think of it as all the weapons in one. So you can start from a very far distant striking range, and as range collapses, you start using it to hook legs or to hook necks, much like you would with a dagger in the German treatise. So it can collapse and expand measure.
Before we go on, I think a couple of questions we really ought to ask is the acquisition of this plate. Where do you get it? How much are you going to pay? Can you also do this in normal HEMA kit with your AP jacket, whatever?
Right. So, okay, so I'm going to take those questions backwards, if you don't mind, in reverse order. I absolutely encourage anyone with an interest in any of the medieval sword arts to practice the armored combat techniques, even if you don't have the armor yet. It's very easy for you to simply choose that, you know, say you put on your AP jacket, you go out there and fencing mask and whatever. The only things that are gonna count in our training period is if you hit me here, right? That's it. That's the only available target. All other targets are off. That's all you get. And then practice with the techniques as they're written in that way. Certainly, I practiced them for years before I had any armor whatsoever. Then once you start getting armor, you can inform your techniques more and more and more, but you're not learning them, if that makes sense. You've already learned them. It's just your tools got better. There's quite a few places that you can get armor. You know, I know in the States, for instance, there's a club in Kansas City that's being run by Trevor Clements and Bruce Rawitch, excuse me, and they feel very passionate about the armored side of the art, and so they've put in a personal effort that they can, through them, purchasing through them, outfit somebody head to toe for about $2,000 US. You know, and it's
standard price.
That's a very entry-level price. I mean, armor can go up into the $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 range.
What's one go to for advice on purchasing armor? What sort of forums are there?
Well, so advice on armor that is specific to very HEMA-oriented, like, again, the very historical study of armor, because there's all kinds of armored fighting out there. But areas that are specific to that are pretty limited. I tend to think of still going to myarmory.com. I don't know if you're familiar with that site. Yes. They do a lot of sword stuff as well, but I think you'll get advice there that will be appropriate to historical study, as opposed to, say, the Armor Archive, where they have great forums and knowledgeable people, but it tends to be more focused on, say, the SCA side of the house or the Battle of Nations side of the house, that style of fighting.
Right, and to be quite clear, I'm not trying to draw fire here, but Battle of the Nations, etc., SCA is completely different in the equipment and as well as the techniques and the attitude than HEMA Armoured Combat.
Absolutely, absolutely, 100%. I think everybody would agree with that. That it's a different beast. You know, one of the things that differentiates what someone studying HEMA Armoured Combat is trying to do, as opposed to maybe, you know, the other areas, is that we are trying to fight a person in armor in such a way that were our swords sharp, it would kill them. Does that make sense? Yes. We're trying to fight with them in such a way that we are disabling their armor, right? Whereas in other areas, or for instance, even, you know, like in unarmored HEMA, when we put on our jackets and our, you know, our elbow cops and all of our stuff, that stuff is there to protect us against blows to it. Whereas in armored combat, you're attacking the areas that are vulnerable in that. So it might be the equivalent of, say at Swordfish, if someone were deliberately hitting to, you know, just below the forearm and the elbow, like there's that little area that isn't protected, and you know, you try to gack the guy there and hurt him, right? So that's kind of what we're doing. So not only do we have the armor that we have to buy, but we have to buy specialized training swords and daggers, etc., to study this side of the house.
Well, that's interesting. So you don't just buy a feather.
No. Because so a lot of the things that happen in armored combat with swords is that maybe you're using it as a lever, or you're putting a lot of pressure against even, I mean, you know, you typically try to put it against the edge of the blade, but it might come against the flat as you're wrapping someone's arm up with your sword, and they're in armor and you're in armor, and so yeah, if you mess around while everybody's in full kit, say with a fetter, like you feel like you're going to snap it in half.
Okay. Do you happen to have one of those swords there? I see you have a couple of swords behind you. Is one of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So this particular one was made by Scott Wilson at Darkwood.
Yeah. Okay.
Darkwood Armory. Okay. And so much like you see sometimes in museum pieces where there were these specialized swords for fighting in armor where they have this area here to grasp that is not determined. But it's ridiculously stiff compared to a fetter.
That's interesting. Cool.
So and you know, much the same that the daggers that we need to use really can't have any flexibility to them.
Okay. What sort of physical conditioning do you need to fight in armor?
Fighting in armor. So my kit, you know, I'm 5'7", 140 pounds, 135 pounds, something like that, and my armor is about 60 pounds. So it's a good percentage of my body weight. But so the things that you're going to run into is, of course, having your body encumbered like that. It's like you all of a sudden, you know, you weigh half again more.
Yeah.
And so you feel that, not that it feels heavy like backpacking, it's not that kind of encumbrance, but that just, you know, you'll feel like, man, I was just kind of walking around and doing some stuff and all of a sudden I'm out of breath, right? It kind of just hits you like that. So, you know, you do have to do a lot of, I would suggest doing a lot of strength training and doing a lot of work while wearing bits of your armor. You know, it's kind of a pain to get it all on all the time, but you could say throw your legs on and go for a walk around the block, or, you know, whatever it might be. But just incorporating it more and more as you're doing just daily sorts of exercises could be very helpful. The other thing that can happen is that depending on your helmet and how your breastplate fits and other things, you'll find that you're rebreathing your carbon dioxide. You learn how to fight in an oxygen-deprived state, which is a really unnatural and bizarre thing to do. So you learn how to very much control your breath, much like a swimmer might. So it wouldn't surprise me if activity like swimming wouldn't be a good choice, because you just have to keep moving even though you're not getting the kinds of oxygen you're used to. Okay.
Now you have, Jessica, you have MS. How does that affect your training?
I do. So MS stands for multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disease, wherein my body is attacking the myelin sheaths on my nerves. So it basically, you know, if you think of it as a mouse getting in and eating the insulation off the wiring in your homes, and suddenly your lights are flickering, that's kind of what my nerves are doing.
Okay.
It gets, for me, how it's affected my HEMA training in particular is that I have to be very careful about my core temperature. So one of the weird things about MS is that as your temperature rises, you know, which for some people can be going outside on a sunny day, I tend to not notice it until I'm really exercising and really working up a sweat. But it can exacerbate the symptoms. So, for instance, typically if I've been sparring for a while and, you know, you're sweating inside your jacket and everything, my right hand and foot go numb. So, which totally sucks for swordsmanship, I might add. It totally sucks, you know. Everybody's talking about, oh, you must have all this finesse and you have to feel everything, and I'm like, well, I can't feel a damn thing, but whatever. let's just keep going. Yeah, in armor, it totally sucks. So one of the things I do.
It's not the best of choices, really, is
Why are
it?
you doing this?
I'm clearly quite mad. It's the only explanation. So what I do is I try to. There's little gel packs that you can freeze. Yeah, there's little gel packs. So you can buy those in strips, almost like a packing. I'm losing my words. What is that called? The stuff that you pop.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, the kind of bubble wrap or something.
Bubble wrap. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so you can buy like bubble wrap that you can freeze, right, with the gel in it. And so I've played with like tucking that in my arming coat just to keep my core temperature down.
I'm sorry, I've just got this vision of you in authentic, very expensive armor, and then on the inside.
We're all gonna fight getting older, and we're all gonna fight, injuries and whatever, and you just find a way to work around it and keep going. And it's the same for me. I just have to, pay attention to what's going on, and occasionally I will say, some people say, hey, let's go spar, and I'll say, no. And my reason is, at some point, I start to doubt my control, right?
Okay.
I start to doubt my ability to sense what's really happening in the fight, if that numbness creeps up too much. Okay. And so, if I ever say, no, not right now, it's because I don't want to accidentally hurt you.
Okay,
but,
thank you.
That's all.
Do you find that people treat you a little bit differently because of this? Because of the MS as well?
No. You know what? No. For the most part, no. I maybe get more concerned, like, hey, are you tired? Are you doing all right? Like maybe more than the average fighter gets. But for the most part, no. I mean, I don't know. I mean, probably after this, more people know I have it. For the most part, most people don't even know. And I just, keep on trucking and doing this thing I love. So.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
I've got to ask something about the Armoured Combat I saw at Long Point.
Sure.
Now, I'd never seen Armoured Combat in a competition setting before. I was quite excited to see it, because obviously these guys look great, and you did a wonderful introduction. And then they went into the ring, and then they moved very slowly towards each other. And it was really quite pedestrian in comparison, say, what we would see in, the longsword and the other forms. Is that, why is that? Because we know it's a myth that we're not seeing people lifted onto horses with cranes. All of that stuff's been dismissed ages and ages ago. So people are mobile in the armor. So right. What's happening with this?
There were quite a few things, I think, but I will say, as a fighter again, that conservation of energy is so important when you're wearing armor. So this space out here where you can't hit each other, why run? There's no point. That's a waste of energy to get there. So we started them quite a bit out, and so they approach slowly. That also being said, I had really hoped that Jake and Ben could have gotten some covering so that we wouldn't jack up the floor in the hotel with all of our armor. And so I had kind of very strongly told the fighters, make sure they didn't fall and ruin the floor and cost Jake a lot of money. So, there were some things happening there that were because we were unsure of the venue. The fighters were unsure of how much energy they were going to be able to maintain, and there's a whole lot of things happening.
So there's actually a danger in people watching the live stream of these events. They're seeing an unrepresentative picture of Armoured Combat, at least in the HEMA context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think if people were particularly looking at that video, they are seeing a very restrained set of the techniques, and that on say more natural footing outside where people don't have to worry about slipping on the carpet, breaking the hotel venue, etc., that you would see a lot more go get 'em in the fight. That also, the other thing I was thinking about that, and this is something that we didn't really discuss earlier when we were talking about the openings that are available to hit in such a way that might be considered a point or considered a good hit. Every person that was out there at say Long Point had a completely different suit of armor, which meant that every person had different areas you had to focus on and try to hit. So as a fighter, you can't just go, well, everybody's inside of the elbow is open. That wasn't true. A couple of the fighters had a lot less opening there than the others. So that also kind of changes the setup as you approach in an armored scenario. You're trying to figure out, like, where can I even hit this guy, right? That's going to matter. And there's no point at swinging at something that isn't going to do any good. And you don't want to overextend yourself and have him take advantage of that opportunity. So there is very much a conservative set to the approach. And then you'll find that once fighters get tied up or get into range, that things collapse very quickly and start moving very quickly, at least from the inside. If you are wanting to approach a sparring scenario or even a tournament scenario where you are fighting the armor the guy is wearing, right? Then it does make you make some choices about how you approach the scenario. Say Bob Charette's armor that he was wearing at Long Point, he was extremely covered, right? When I go to fight Bob, I've fought him in that armor a number of times, and in part because I'm short, but compared to him, but in part because of his armor. Like, the only thing I can think of to get to is up under his fold, which is the part that's coming down from his breastplate, right? So kind of that groin opening, unfortunately for Bob.
But nothing wrong with attacking the groin.
Totally.
But this is interesting then. So what we're saying is that we have something completely different to what we know in normal HEMA competition or other competitions. Without it being very false historically, we cannot standardize, and therefore that's going to have to require a different mindset in the approach.
Yeah, and it's something that we've talked about as far as those that are really into competition mindset and gaming and thinking about that. I mean, you may be personally drawn towards earlier armor forms or that sort of thing, but they just don't cover as well, right? So if you're like, I want to get into HEMA Armored Combat and I want to totally kick everybody's ass, like you can make armor choices about what you're going to wear that's going to give you more protection and offer your opponent less openings. That being said, doing that is going to make you more encumbered physically, right? So you will actually, you have the opportunity to face that same great question that medieval men on the battlefield did, which was, I want to be as protected as possible, but I also, want to be able to move and breathe and all those things. We have all those accounts of like guys getting exhausted and not being able to breathe on the battlefield, right? And thinking they're out of range and lifting up their helmet and taking an arrow to the face. For the purposes of HEMA Armored Combat, for instance, like right now, my helmet, which I could grab and show if you want.
Yes, please do.
So this is the helmet that I wear. It's from Windrose Armory. They call it their Fiore helmet. So it's based off of kind of a bassinet shape, right? But it has this kind of modern mesh face, right?
Yeah.
It's a thicker than they call it perf plate, right? It's thicker than fencing mask by far, but it's very, very modern, right? So I can see really well, I can breathe really well, I don't get too hot in it. But for the purposes of combat, this gets treated like an open face.
Yeah, okay.
So my whole face is open to any of my opponents. And so, you know, I make that choice. Well, for me, it's monetary. I don't have the money for a new helmet. But
again, this comes back to another interesting point. I mean, we, certainly Hans and I, on many occasions have discussed, Carl Rierberg's on this as well, standardization of HEMA kits. A lot of it to try and get away from, say, the more SEA or the reenactment guys, or for some of the more LARPy elements, but also a standardization of form for protection.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's going to be this actually happening in Armoured Combat? It looks to me that a lot of this has come directly from, I mean, you've alluded to very expensive suits, but obviously from that reenactment side as well, I guess. Do you think there's going to be a HEMA type of armour that's going to be applicable to this, assuming this actual area grows?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, a big part of what draws people to, you know, make the investment in armor is because they're attracted to a certain aesthetic. And we have, you know, a pretty diverse range of armor aesthetics available to us, and to still stay in the fight book period, right? Still be appropriate for the manuals that we're studying. So, you know, while it would make judging like way easier, it would make some parts of the competition easier. I don't know that I see that happening anytime soon on the armored side of the house. I think everybody would rather just, you know, hey, you know, Jess, don't get hit in the face. Like, you know, according to the rules we were fighting under typically, like that's instant kill. I'm out. I'm dead. Right? So I have to cover my face. That's my job.
Okay. Now, I don't know if we're going to talk more about the armored fighting, but you also have a thing that we wanted to show you. That's a book on wrestling, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
You just, I think you should introduce that to us. Just show it and talk a little bit about it. So.
But yeah, so this is, there we go. That's my book, Medieval Wrestling, which
is... Move it over to the right a little bit so we can see the picture more. Perfect. So what that is, it began, oh boy, I started writing it many years ago. I kind of thought, oh man, maybe I'll make a blog, or maybe I'll, I don't know, just make a PDF and throw it up, and about Master Ott's wrestling treatise. And I really kind of got started on it, oh my gosh, it was probably 04 or 05. Okay. And I studied judo back before I got into HEMA, and so I saw there's this wrestling treatise in the Von Danzig compendium, and I was like, oh man, this looks pretty cool. And so I called up my instructor, Christian Tobler, and I said, hey, so do you have an interpretation of this? Could you send that to me? And he was like, no, I'm not a wrestler. I don't have that. You know, you go do that. And so I was like, oh, all right, I guess I'll do that. So that's how that started, and eventually, as I worked on it more and more, it was like, no, this needs to be a book. So it has has a little bit of potentially biographical information about Master Ott. I did some research on the context of medieval wrestling, maybe, you know, some ideas on what the rule set might have been that they were wrestling under, and then I went ahead and did an interpretation of his wrestling techniques and presented that. So.
And if people want to buy that, from where can you buy it?
You can pick it up at freelanceacademypress.com, and that comes straight from the publisher, and they should be able to ship worldwide. And if you have any trouble, you can always just drop me a line.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Rob, anything?
Okay, I was just going to say thanks very much for joining us, Jess, and for introducing us to Armoured Combat. And cheers for your time.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.